Turning to page 73 of the calendar, House Bill 2096, a bill to amend and reenact sections of the Code of Virginia relating to the creation of the Opportunity Educational Institution. Report from the Committee on Education with a substitute on January 30th. Report from the Committee on Appropriations with a substitute on February 1st.
The gentleman from Salem, Mr. Habeeb.
Mr. Speaker, I'm going to ask the House to reject the Education Committee substitute and accept the Appropriations substitute.
The question is on adoption of the substitute offered by the Committee on Education. As many as favor that motion will say aye. Those opposed, no. No. That substitute is rejected. The question is on the adoption of the substitute offered by the Committee on Appropriations. As many as favor that motion will say aye. Aye. Those opposed, no. That substitute is agreed to. Gentleman from Salem.
Mr. Speaker, I'd like the body to note that Delegate Landis voted yes, and I expect him to vote yes here momentarily. Mr. Speaker, members of the body, this is the Governor's Opportunity Educational Institution bill. We are all very proud of our great public schools in Virginia. We hear people talk a lot about how survey after survey rates them high. However, we also have to admit at the same time we have a handful of chronically underperforming schools in this state. The problem has become so bad in some of these areas that it is in fact now a jurisdictional problem. It is not just the school's fault. It is many institutions in the community, in the family, things kids see on TV, drugs and violence in their culture, the breakdown of the family, but all of that plays out in these schools, and there have simply become developed institutional barriers to the success of a small number of schools. As a result of that, the governor has proposed to create a new statewide school division that after a school fails to reach accreditation a certain number of years, that the supervision of that school could be overseen by a new statewide board that could bring new innovation and tools into that locality. I would tell the body that this bill passed 18-3 in education. In the process, we addressed some of the substantive policy issues raised. It then passed 18-4 in appropriations with some very precise funding language that addressed some of the concerns raised. Happy to answer any questions, but I would move the body engross the bill and pass it to its third reading.
Gentleman from Augusta, Mr. Landis.
Mr. Speaker, speaking to the bill.
Gentleman may proceed.
Mr. Speaker and ladies and gentlemen of the House, as you will see that in the Appropriations Committee, I was one of the ones that did not vote for this, and I want to explain a little bit about some of us that still have concerns related to this legislation. Although I agree with the gentleman from Salem on the intent of what he's trying to accomplish in the governor's reform related to this, because there does need to be a mechanism to try to deal with these schools that are just failing in the Commonwealth. And I think we all agree that we need to try to do what we can to improve them and to bring them up. The problem with this legislation is rather than have the Board of Education be the body that would accomplish that, we set up another layer of bureaucracy within the public education system. One of the things that I've become convinced of in the last few years is we don't need to add more layers of bureaucracy with public education. We have elected school boards. We have superintendents. We have local school systems that try to do the best they can. We have a Board of Education. We have a Department of Education. And my gosh, we have a U.S. Department of Education, which I don't even think is even appropriate. But we continue to layer upon layer additional bureaucracies for education. That is not what we should be doing. We need to try to simplify and make the process better. And the intent of this legislation is very appropriate, and I understand and agree with it. The implementation is the problem, and I hope you will not support the bill.
The gentleman from Madison, Mr. Scott.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. Speaking to the bill.
Gentleman may proceed.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. Mr. Speaker, ladies and gentlemen of the House, I rise today to speak in support of House Bill 2096. And I do so sharing with you that I had the chance this past fall to be part of a bipartisan group of legislators, business leaders, and administration officials who went to Louisiana to see what they are doing in the area of school reform. And I was fortunate to be part of that group. We saw some very interesting things down there. One of the things that we saw down there was the mechanism by which Louisiana, and in particular in the city of New Orleans, they are taking over and reforming failed schools. And in Louisiana, they do it with what they call the Recovery School District. The Recovery School District started initially in the city of New Orleans. It now is available to parishes all across Louisiana, is doing work both in the inner city as well as in some of the rural areas. This is a model that has also been adopted by the state of Tennessee. They call theirs the Achievement School District. Mr. Speaker, ladies and gentlemen of the House, if we are going to truly reform the small number of failing schools that we have in the Commonwealth of Virginia, and if we are going to truly try to do something for students that are trapped in those schools, we need a new structure. The current structure, whether you want to look at the local school board, whether you want to look at the Board of Education, it's not working. The schools that have had trouble have perennially had trouble. We need a new mechanism. This is a tool that has been tried and has been successful, and I encourage adoption of the bill.
The gentleman from Loudoun, Mr. Greasy.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. Mr. Speaker, speaking to the bill.
Gentleman has floor.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. Mr. Speaker, I'll be brief. I wanted to address the comments from my good friend from Augusta, thank you, Delegate Landis. And talking about additional layers of bureaucracy, I think is a little misleading in this particular circumstance. While it is certainly a separate institution, I will suggest to you that we are replacing the current failing oversight body that has failed this school year in and year out. These schools are going on 2, 3, 4, 5 years of failing, and I would suggest to you by putting a layer of administration on top of the current failing administration would not be something I would support. Delegate Landis would be correct, but we are not doing that. We are replacing the failing oversight body. We are moving it to the side, and we are putting in a new body that can bring additional oversight to what's happening in these schools. We believe this is the right way to go in trying to get these schools back on track. And once these schools are back to accreditation, they will go back into the normal school system because they will have the foundation that will continue on for years to come. Mr. Speaker, I support this legislation. I hope the members will as well.
The gentleman from Alexandria, Mr. Kopika.
Mr. Speaker, will the gentleman yield for a question?
Will the gentleman yield? Which gentleman? I forgot.
The patron.
Sorry,
Mr. Speaker.
Gentleman yield for a question.
I yield.
Gentleman yields.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. I agree with the intent of this legislation. Having seen and sat on the State Board of Education and witnessed a number of school districts that kind of meet the criteria that this legislation is intended for, I concur wholeheartedly with the expectation for this. But my question, my first question, builds on the gentleman from Augusta's comments, which is, as we create this new bureaucracy that has the ability to direct local tax dollars and how they be spent, which has the ability to hold on to a local school as long as it sees fit, where is the check on that bureaucracy to ensure they are always acting in the best interest of the children?
Mr. Speaker, I would answer the gentleman that we've made some policy changes to the bill as it went through, including adding an ex officio member of the local school board, in this case the chairman of the local school board, to the body. The reality is we have a constitutional obligation to provide a high-quality education, and we are failing in a few limited places. It is our responsibility to provide it. The check on this process is the same political check that is on everything we do and on every gubernatorial appointment that the governor makes. There is nobody in this General Assembly who is going to relish the opportunity to manage and fund the operation of a significant number of schools in jurisdictions across the state. We have a constitutional obligation to fulfill it. I'm confident that as soon as we do that in every jurisdiction, we'll be happy to move on and let the localities pick up the new infrastructure that's in place and see that those 3,000 kids that are currently in failing schools that we are letting down get to have the high-quality education they're constitutionally guaranteed.
Mr. Speaker, will the gentleman yield for another question?
Will the gentleman yield?
I yield.
Gentleman yields.
Under the proposed legislation, this new institute has the ability to take over a local building and direct local taxpayers to pay for improvements and fixes to that building. What is the mechanism to control the demands of the institute on local taxpayers?
Mr. Speaker, I'll tell the gentleman he's read the bill and knows what the language says. The appropriations staff worked long and hard on getting the right language. The goal from a funding standpoint was to ensure that there was adequate funding to accomplish the needs necessary for these kids, that we didn't fund it at a lower level, at the same time not increasing the burden on the localities. I believe what the gentleman is probably referring to is the obligation of the state not make capital improvements to a facility. Of course, there'd be no incentive for the state to come in and then be forced to make a bunch of capital improvements. On the flip side, the state can't obligate the locality to do anything. The state is not taking over ownership of any buildings. It is not taking over schools. What it is doing is taking over the failed supervision, providing supervision, using those facilities that are available to accomplish the goal, educate these kids, meet our constitutional and moral obligations, and get out as quickly as possible.
Mr. Speaker, will the gentleman yield for another question?
Will the gentleman yield?
I will.
Gentleman yields.
A teacher choosing to accept a job in a school that is struggling, as considered in this legislation, has to make some hard choices about whether or not they're going to go work in a school that has as many obstacles as the schools under consideration here. What confidence can that teacher have under this legislation that taking a job in such a challenged school will not immediately result in them losing that job when the school is taken over?
Mr. Speaker, I have to apologize. I frankly don't understand what the question was. If the teacher is already teaching in the school, they've already taken a job in this locality. If the supervision has already been taken over by the state will have made hiring decisions, which will include, in almost certainty, the hiring of some current employees as well as some new employees. Maybe he's asking me about a school that's about to have the supervision taken over and whether someone not wants to apply. And I would tell the gentleman that as the husband of a teacher, as the brother of a public school administrator, and the son of a teacher, there are dozens and dozens of factors that go into every teacher making their own employment decisions. And I'm not going to judge why and how a particular teacher makes their decision. Some teachers choose very admirably to intentionally go into schools that are suffering because they feel that's their calling, and some are called to go elsewhere. So why and how a teacher may make that decision is a personal decision for that teacher to make.
Mr. Speaker?
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. May I ask one more question?
Help yourself, yeah. Gentleman yield.
Yes, sir.
Gentleman yields.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. Louisiana is an interesting example. And they've had some success with their program like this, but they've also had a lot of mediocre outcomes with their program that we're trying to emulate here. As this legislation is drafted, the new institute can hold on to a school indefinitely, regardless of whether they are moving that school toward higher achievement or not. Could the patron please explain to me what mechanism there is if the institute is failing to bring the schools back to the local division or to some other place?
Mr. Speaker, I would tell the gentleman, first of all, the reference to Louisiana is an interesting one because a lot of people in the status quo public education institutions will say, well, we're fourth in the country in education. We're much better than Louisiana. Why are we modeling ourselves after Louisiana? Let's be clear. We are not modeling ourselves after the entire Louisiana education system. What we are doing is looking at successes around the country in places that have dealt with failing schools, with chronically underperforming schools. You've heard that Louisiana and Tennessee have both put their own model into place. We are trying to learn from their failures and successes. Now, what we do not want to have is a one-size-fits-all demand that the new opportunity educational institution do exactly certain things on exactly certain days, depart at an exact certain time, and tie the hands of that board. We want them to have the flexibility to bring the innovation and tools to the particular school that that particular school needs. A school in Salem may need very different things than a school in Arlington needs. So rather than put a date certain on there or a moment in accreditation certain in there, we've given them flexibility to do what they can do. Again, a lot of this is based upon my belief, and I think the belief held certainly by the Appropriations and Education Committees who reviewed this, that the state does not have an interest in running these schools in perpetuity. Our goal is to meet our moral and constitutional obligation, educate these 3,000 kids who we are failing on a daily basis, and move on.
Mr. Speaker, speaking to the bill.
I will call on you when it's time, okay? I've got several people ahead of you in the queue. You can keep popping up, but I'm not going to call on you until it's time. Just want to make sure.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. I think the intent of this bill is...
The gentleman speaking to the bill?
Yes, speaking to the bill.
I'm going to get some other people and I'll come back.
I'll come back. Thank you.
Gentleman from Roanoke City, Mr. Ware.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. Speaking to the bill, Mr. Speaker, I came through all public schools. Greensboro, North Carolina, proud of it. James B. Dudley High School had some of the greatest teachers in public schools that I can think of. I'm not sure they'd say the same about me. But I was a pretty good student, Mr. Speaker, and I can tell you from the public school system is where I had decided probably by the time I was in the 9th grade that I wanted to be a lawyer. And I only decided that I wanted to be an attorney was because a teacher told me I could be one, because I had enough nerve to stand up in front of class and give a report while everybody else was afraid. And so I know the value of the public school system. And I support it 100%, and I still think the public school system does a great job. But that was over 40 years ago when I came through public schools. Things have changed some, Mr. Speaker. And I've been down here on the Education Committee for 10 years. And I've seen all of the efforts being made by the Department of Education, the VEA, and they're all laudable efforts. But we're still failing somewhere, and it bothers me that the place that we're failing, there are people who look like me. Let's just be honest. The failing school systems are those we, quote, call urban school systems. And I hate that word because when I hear the word urban, I know that they're talking about African Americans and Latino and socially, economically deprived students. I know that, and you all know it too. And so I've had to sort of expand my thinking some, because my job down here is to ensure that every kid gets an education. I don't believe in dumb and smart people because I'm not a smart person, but I'm not a dumb person. But I've achieved because somebody gave me access and somebody allowed me to learn the way that I learned. I can't learn like a Jennifer. Jennifer's probably the delegate, the late general lady from Roanoke City probably gets it the first time. That's not honestly where. I've got to see it, I've got to feel it, and I got to do it. And many of you may be the same way. So all I'm saying is this is not a desertion of the public schools. I asked all of you to just open your mind a little bit. We all hate change. I know I do. And when somebody asks me to change, the first thing I do is get defensive. What's wrong with me? Well, it could be a lot of things wrong with me. It could be nothing wrong with me. But we do know this. We got kids in this commonwealth that the school systems have flunked not 5 times, but 10. And some of my colleagues know exactly what I'm talking about. And as I say, these are kids that look like me and look like some of you all. They can't happen how they were born, their color, they're Latino, and they certainly can't help it because they're, as we say, socially, economically deprived. I call it poor. And I was poor in all those things. But I had access, and I had good teachers, and I was taught the right way, and I was taught not to fail, and I wasn't given a lower standard. I'm simply saying the reason why I support this legislation, not because it's perfect, but I really think we ought to check it out, see if it works, fine. If it doesn't, we shouldn't go back to what's failing. We should try to look for something else. So, ladies and gentlemen, members of the body, I support the legislation. Thank you.
The gentleman from Stanton, Mr. Bell.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. Speaking to the bill.
The gentleman has the floor.
I would submit to you that rather than another level of bureaucracy, this is a direct and proactive attempt to cut through several levels of ineffective bureaucracy that already exist. We're talking about dealing with schools that have failed for more than 2 years, that are not accredited. Obviously, those bureaucracies in place that are supposed to address that aren't working. This does not take over schools forever. There's a 5-year clause at which time they're raised to the accreditation level and they're turned back over to their school system. This is an attempt to save failing schools, an attempt to save students who are captured in those failing schools, and that's all it is. This is a good bill, and I encourage you to support it.
The gentleman from Prince William, Mr. Marshall.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. Would the patron of the bill resume the floor for a question?
Will the gentleman yield?
I will.
The gentleman yields.
Thank you very much, Mr. Speaker. Mr. Speaker, I am looking at the bill, and I see the term on page 3, The institute shall be administered and supervised by the Opportunity Education Institution Board. And the gentleman himself, in response to the prior questioner, talked about the supervision of schools as being, of these schools anyway, being subject to this board, the composition of which is determined in a section that follows shortly thereafter, and the Speaker gets to appoint some people and so on. But, Mr. Speaker, I would call the gentleman's attention to what's left of the Virginia Constitution at Article 8, Section 7. It states, the supervision of schools in each school division shall be vested in a school board to be composed of members selected in a manner for the term possessing the qualifications and number provided for by law. Now, Mr. Speaker, I was here when we had this huge fight over elected school boards. We passed a law allowing a locality to determine whether they have elected or appointed school boards. So my question here, since the school division is in fact coterminous with a locality, how in fact are we not violating the Virginia Constitution, because each school division is supposed to be responsible for the schools, and the gentleman represents his own words, the supervision of the schools is with this statewide school board, and that seems to be prohibited by this provision of the Virginia Constitution.
Mr. Speaker, I would draw the gentleman's attention to Article 8, Section 9 of the Virginia Constitution, if he continues to scroll down slightly further, which says that the General Assembly may provide for the establishment, maintenance, and operation of any educational institutions which are desirable for the intellectual, cultural, and occupational development of the people of the Commonwealth. If he reads the bill on the last page, he'll see how this has been drawn into the other educational institution section, analogous to, for example, the Virginia School for the Deaf and Blind and many other institutions that have been created. The Constitution requires that those institutions be overseen by a board, which is what we have done here. Certainly, if the gentleman is concerned about the constitutionality of this bill, I encourage him to support the constitutional amendment that he'll probably see in about 30 minutes to an hour, depending on when the transportation debate occurs, so that we can resolve that question once and for all. It is certainly not inappropriate to ask the constitutional questions, as some have, which is why the constitutional amendment has been proposed. Nonetheless, some lawyers a lot smarter than I have reviewed this and are confident of the constitutionality of this bill, and I certainly hope the body will support it.
Further question?
Will the gentleman yield?
Yes, sir.
Gentleman yields.
Did the Attorney General render opinion that a local school, this is not establishing a different kind of school in the sense in which I think the gentleman mentions. I understand this is the class of students in failing schools, but it's still, I don't understand how you can get around this provision of the Constitution where the school boards, the school division is supposed to be in charge of the supervision of the school. We have a school in Northern Virginia, Thomas Jefferson, where children attend from a number of jurisdictions. But that school is still responsible for, it's a science and technology school. That school is still under the control of a local school board, even though students are picked from a number of Northern Virginia jurisdictions. That seems to comply with this. I don't disagree with the goal. I'm puzzled as to how the gentleman can reach it with Article 8, Section 7 still intact.
Mr. Speaker, I believe the gentleman's question related to the Attorney General's office. I've not spoken to the Attorney General's office, nor have they spoken to me. Going beyond to what the gentleman said after his initial question, these students are currently in a school division governed by a school board. When this bill goes into effect, they will go into an other educational institution governed by a board. This is all very clearly set out in Article 8, Section 9, and I would ask the body's support.
The gentleman from Henrico, Mr. Farrell.
Mr. Speaker, I have a motion.
Gentleman may say it.
I move the pending question.
The gentleman from Henrico, Mr. Farrell, moves the pending question. As many as favor that motion will say aye. Aye. Those opposed, no. The questions on engrossment, shall the bill be engrossed and passed to its third reading? As many as favor that motion will say aye. Aye. Those opposed, no. No. The bill is engrossed and passed to its third reading.